24. Bernard had thought himself in a pleasantly fuzzy state of inebriation until Ursula sank into the mattress beside him. Now he was painfully aware of every breath she took, imagining the rise and fall of her breasts. She leaned over him and he felt her breath on his face. His eyes snapped open, staring. "A kiss of peace for Yule is a time for such things," she whispered. Then her lips touched his, and Bernard had no time for words. Somewhere in the back of his brain was the thought that he would not dishonor her with a kiss. Then his hands cupped her face, his fingertips grazing those soft curls that always seemed to escape her braid, and he kissed her back with everything in his being. Tongues, lips, breath, all swirled together in a passionate union like nothing he'd ever tasted before. More than the delicious sweetness of the drunken chestnuts that lingered on her tongue. More than the willing woman opening to him, wanting everything he longed to give her. Then her breath caught and she broke the kiss, her eyes wide with horror. "Bernard, I'm so sorry. I promised I would not ask for more than warmth, but I've never kissed anyone quite like that before, and I lost my way." She swallowed. "I am sorry." Bernard grinned. "I'm not. All night I've been wishing for some mistletoe, so that I might have an excuse to kiss you. You may ask for anything you like, and I may choose to grant it or not. But you're king." The way she'd said it, his king, not hers, made him consider her earlier words about her own monarch. Beerhaven did owe fealty to a different king, and if he could stay here, he would be truly free. "Not my king anymore. I may have been his favorite on the crusade, but when we arrived home, it was a different story. He likes women, you see, not men, and when he returned to court, he selected the prettiest maiden there to be his new favorite. A duke's daughter named Dulcinea." He sighed heavily. His memories of Dulcinea were more than enough to smother his desire. So he made her his queen? Bernard's heart ached for Ursula's innocence. Dulcinea had probably thought the same thing once. No. He made her his whore. Ursula gave a pained cry. "But why?" she whispered. "How could a man who has any honor at all?" "The king has no honor. A man who rapes pages and maiden daughters is a stranger to honor and chivalry, and any good quality really does not deserve his power or the loyalty of his people. Just as Dulcinea did not deserve her fate. Which he'd made worse by trying to help her, he thought but did not say. Her soft hand patted his cheek. "I'm so sorry." Pity dripped from her words, as sweet and seductive as honey. Bernard resolutely pushed her hand away. "So am I, for I must remind you of your promise. We may share a bed for warmth but nothing else. Better that we not touch, for temptation is a terrible thing." "Of course." She retreated to the other side of the bed, her hands no longer touching him. For a moment Bernard wanted to apologize and pull her into his arms so she could sleep in his embrace as she had that day she'd found her family's grave, but he knew better than anyone where that would lead, so he held his tongue. Though he could think of a dozen other things he could do with it, without endangering her honor. In his dreams maybe. 25. Day after day, the snow fell, building up deeper and deeper in the courtyard until Ursula had to take up a shovel to find the woodpile again. And still the snow fell until it stopped. She should have known the true winter freeze had set in, really, for that's what it felt like every year when the fire in her tower room was no longer enough to keep the cold at bay. But waking up in Bernard's arms, her face pressed against his chest, confused her more than she was willing to admit. She lay there a moment longer than she should have, enjoying the warmth, before she'd forced herself to move away. She tried to tell herself that he must have grabbed her in her sleep, but she knew it was a lie. Such a shared embrace showed she'd sought him out, as much as he'd wanted her to. It wasn't until she slid out from under the blankets to mend the fire that she realized why. The flagstones beneath her feet were so cold she could feel the chill coming up through her socks. Her breath misted in front of her face as she built up the fire as fast as she knew how, adding an extra log to fuel the blaze. She longed to creep back into bed next to Bernard, cuddling up to him consciously, much as she had in sleep, but she knew she could not. A baron's daughter did not cuddle up to an ordinary soldier, except if necessity required it, such as to stop herself from freezing to death. But as she pulled on a gown followed by a thick overdress before topping the lot with her fur-lined cloak, she imagined what her life might be like if the world were different. If Bernard were more than a common soldier, or she was less than her father's daughter. If their different stations in life would allow them to marry, so that he would be more than just a warm presence in her bed, perhaps even her husband. She suspected he would make a good husband too. Kind and caring, but with a deeper knowledge than most men, for he was well-traveled, and he could converse on more matters than simply swordplay, hunting and the state of the harvest. She snorted, making another little puff of mist. If she was some low-born soldier's wife, she would have to cook him breakfast, instead of fetching supplies from the kitchen so that he might do the cooking. She pulled on her fur-lined boots, and crept quietly out of the room. But if destiny had been kinder and made him a high-born lord or baron, she didn't dare aspire to marrying a prince. She knew life was no fairy tale. She would be allowed to lie abed with him for longer, making love to him or letting him make love to her. Servants would bring their breakfast and see to their needs, so that Bernard could see to the security of Behaven. No, not Behaven. Bernard's lands would be far grander than her beautiful valley home. If fate were kinder, it would let her keep Behaven and give her a husband strong enough to defend it. But to find such a husband she would have to leave this place and seek him out. For such a man would need a large army indeed, to drive off Lord Vauquelin when her family's murderer returned. Had her father lived, come the spring, she'd likely have been headed out of the valley to make that marriage alliance he'd planned anyway. She sighed as she gathered up suitable things for breakfast, and what Bernard had wanted to make their dinner for later. This time, the wedge of cheese she knew she'd left on the table was gone. When spring came, she resolved, she would ask some of the men in town if they could trap the rats that stole so brazenly from her kitchen. In the meantime, she decided to carry a whole cheese upstairs, for the rats did not rob their food stores in the tower. With her basket considerably heavier than usual, Ursula trudged up the stairs. As was his custom, Bernard had shifted from the bed to his pallet on the floor. He told her many times dragging himself from one to the other was nothing and did not hurt at all, but she'd seen the way he gritted his teeth in the evenings when he made the return journey, too many times to ignore. She suspected it was because he did not want her to see his pain. "A whole cheese today. And a ham. How did you manage to carry these up the stairs by yourself?" he asked. She shrugged and forced a smile. "It seems anyone can get used to hard labor, when they have no choice but to do it every day." He grinned. "And as your work is now done, it is time for me to begin mine. Would my lady like me to heat a little of the ham first, or would you like me to attempt those flatbread things the people of the Holy Land made? We still have enough flour for me to try again, and I think I've worked out how to do it right." Ursula considered. If there was one thing she missed most, it was bread. They had plenty of flour, but she had yet to find any of the yeast that was needed to make bread rise. Not to mention, she had no idea of what to do with it if she did. Bread making, and indeed the ovens in the kitchens, were a mystery she had not yet solved. Sadly, Bernard had told her that he could not make bread on the fire up here. So she would have to wait until spring, when the townspeople were up and about again, for her next crust of bread. She watched Bernard as he mixed the batter until it bubbled, then poured it into a pan that he held over the fire with steady hands. He flipped the flat cake, which looked a little like the pancakes the cook had made when she was a child. Yet when he placed the first flat cake on a plate for her, it was as crisp as the crust of ice on the well bucket this morning. Bernard pushed the cheese toward her. "Here, spread some of that on it while I warm you a slice of ham. You may wrap it around itself and eat it like the people of the Holy Land do." "You have so many stories about the Holy Land," she said. Of all the places you have traveled. I wonder what tales you will tell of Beerhaven." He laughed, his eyes on the toasting fork as he turned it to make sure the honey he'd glazed over the ham did not burn. "I heard many stories of this place before I ever set foot in your beautiful valley. The king's library had much to say about it. That it was the home of formidable warriors, who had vanquished every army that had dared to enter the valley. Enter but not leave, for only a handful of cowards ever escaped. One of the books even said to be written by one such coward, told that the warriors were not men at all but the spirits of giant bears made flesh. Bears with the strength of 10 men that no mortal man could stand against. Immortal bears who did not die, but remained in the valley in readiness for the next army to come and try their strength." He laughed softly. "But even in your furry cloak and boots, Ursula, you look far too sweet to be a big scary bear, let alone one who would kill me with a single swipe of her paw. And if there were any bears, then surely they would have come to your aid." Ursula's throat went dry. Dare she tell him about the bears in the caves? Not warriors, not an army, but all that remained of her people. Her grandfather had wanted her to believe the stories he told, but Ursula knew better now. Bernard was right. No army had come to her aid. Therefore they did not exist, if they ever had. Perhaps they were hibernating. I did wonder why Lord Vauquelin attacked so close to winter. Maybe that is why he left so soon too. Attacking while they were asleep, leaving before they could wake. Why, perhaps he did not mean to leave me to starve to death after all. Perhaps he left me as an offering to these pagan bear spirits. A human sacrifice of sorts. No one sacrifices humans in this day and age, she snapped. Only primitive people do that, and they died out a long time ago. Much like the bears in your story, I'm sure. She bit into the rolled-up flatbread in her hands, then moaned as the combination of honey-crusted ham and soft cheese wrapped in that crisp shell exploded in her mouth. Bernard's eyes darkened as he looked at her for a long moment. "If my lady likes it so much, then I must make more." He set the frying pan over the fire again. Things would change when the spring came, Ursula knew, but for now she was happy in her bower, with Bernard and whatever the winter held. 26. Honestly, I'm not sure why we're all told it's so dangerous for an unmarried girl to share a bed with a man. You've been the perfect gentleman every night. To hear my father talk, I thought every nobleman was a monster, wanting to ravish me the moment he got near me. Whereas you haven't even tried to ravish me. Not once. Ursula sounded almost disappointed. Bernard laughed softly. Your father knows all men are tempted to do such things, but honor keeps them resisting temptation. In the Holy Land, the men are not so restrained, or so I must assume. The women there cover not only their hair but their faces too, and their dresses are shapeless, so no man is tempted by what is hidden underneath. They do this because their men apparently turn into ravening monsters if they see a woman's uncovered face. He shrugged. Some of the men thought this was because the women there are more beautiful than the ones here, but I cannot agree. You are lovelier than anything I saw in the Holy Land. She slapped his arm lightly. Flatterer. All you saw were veiled women in shapeless dresses. Under that, those women may have been beautiful enough for men to lose their minds, like the fabled Helen of ancient times. He considered for a moment, then said, perhaps it is not about beauty at all. I met a eunuch in the bathhouse who had once been a pleasure slave in the Sultan's harem. He said the women there have appetites for pleasure just as great as the appetites of men. Maybe even greater, for a woman can have as many men as she wishes in a night, while men rarely last beyond 1 or 2 lovers. It was Ursula's turn to laugh. As many men as I want in a night? That sounds wrong. What husband would allow his wife to have so many lovers? How would he know her children are his? Do you know what a eunuch is? Isn't that the name of some sort of court official in one of the desert kingdoms? No. A eunuch is a man who is no longer a man, because someone has cut off the parts that make him a man. Bernard hoped the darkness would hide his blush. You mean his? Yes. But wouldn't that hurt? Immensely, yes. Then why? Slaves have little choice in it, and that's what he was. When Ursula fell silent, Bernard continued, he told me there are 1,001 ways to pleasure a woman, while men have only 100. He dropped his voice lower. Most of them women learn when they are still maidens in their father's harems, so that they will know what to command of their slaves when they are wives in a harem themselves. But don't they have to be maidens when they marry? Or is that different too? There was such yearning in her voice. Oh yes. They are stricter about such things than we are. If the girl is not chaste, her husband is allowed to kill her, and they do not consider it murder. He heard Ursula's gasp of horror, but he went on, perhaps that is why there are 1,001 ways, and most of them leave a girl's maidenhead intact. She may have both honor and pleasure, and her husband will never know. Can you show me one? Ursula's voice came out as a barely audible whisper, as if she hardly dared say the words. Yet she crept closer to him until her head rested on his chest. Please? Are you sure? He wasn't. Once he started, he wasn't sure he'd be able to stop. Her hand slipped under his tunic and squeezed his cock, leaving him gasping for breath. Yes, I'm sure, she said smugly. He peeled her hand off him, then said, most of the ways involving that part of me will most definitely make you lose your maidenhead. But if I use my fingers and my lips and my tongue. Oh yes. 27. Bernard pushed her off him, so she landed on the pillow beside him. Rejected, she rose onto her elbows to protest. But his hands were already untying the laces of her shift, pulling it down until her shoulders and then her breasts were bare. Instinct made her bring her arms up to cover herself. If you have changed your mind, only say the word and I shall stop, he said. His breath was warm against her forearm, as though his lips were close enough to kiss her arm. Or her breast. What would that feel like? Pleasure, like he'd promised? She forced her arms down by her sides, bearing herself to him. Beautiful, Bernard breathed, close enough for the breeze of it to tickle her nipple. Ursula gasped. Then he kissed her breast, tracing a slow circle around her nipple until he suddenly sucked it into his mouth, and she cried out, arching her back. How could that one touch send a jolt of pleasure so deep inside her? When he released her nipple, her whole breast tingled. Then he turned his attentions to the other until it too tingled like she'd been numb her whole life, and feeling was only just returning. That's one, she heard him say. There's another way, which involves my hands, leaving my mouth free for better things. His hands cupped her breasts, his thumbs pressing against her nipples in small circles. On flesh already made sensitive in his mouth, this was pleasurable torture like nothing she'd ever known before. Then he kissed her, his tongue tracing circles around hers in rhythm with his hands. She let out a little moan, muffled by his mouth on hers. When he heard it, he stopped. Too much for you? Or you don't like it? Bernard's hands left her breasts. I do like it. I have never, is it wrong to feel so good? He laughed but gently. I doubt it. Perhaps I should have started with the way every girl learns, so that she might prepare herself for her wedding night. Yes. Please. She'd have agreed to anything at this point, just to feel his hands on her again. He pushed up the hem of her shift, just as slowly as he'd bared her breasts. Giving her time to hesitate, Ursula thought. But she didn't want him to hurry. The warm caress of his hands on her thighs as he slid the cloth higher was worth savoring. He didn't stop until he had it up around her waist, bearing, well, everything but her belly really. She considered taking the whole thing off, but his hands had crept down to her legs again, stroking the inside of her thighs. She spread her legs wider, wanting to give him more space. Then his thumb found a spot at the apex of her thighs, a spot that made her nipples tighten in loving memory as he started to move his thumb in tight circles, never leaving that spot, and yet. "Oh my God, Bernard," she shrieked as pleasure crashed down on her like an avalanche. When she emerged from the snow flurries in her head, some moments later, she found him staring at her with something like wonder. "What's wrong?" she asked. He just shook his head. "The men of the Holy Land have the right of it. A beautiful woman at the peak of her pleasure is enough to make any man lose his mind. At a word from you, I would gladly spend all night and the rest of the week, showing you the other 998 ways over and over until you had picked a favorite, just so that I might do that one to bring you pleasure again." She blushed, not daring to look at him. He did not sound like a man who had lost his mind. It felt like she had lost hers, shattered into a million pieces before it put itself back together again, but not the same way as before. "It sounds so selfish," she said. "It is. You are a pleasure to watch, Goldilocks." He reached up to tangle a finger in her curls. "Would you like another?" "Yes, please." 28. There were a dozen days and nights of Yule, and Bernard made Ursula a gift of every one. Despite her pleas for more, they had not even reached 100 ways, for she kept asking for the same ones again, and he was only too happy to oblige her. He'd never wanted a wife, never wanted to be forced to share a bed with anyone, ever again, but Ursula could confine him to her bed for the rest of his life and he'd spend every day happy. There was a joy in her he couldn't resist, and he didn't want to. Between her golden hair and golden brown eyes, her skin glowing gold in the firelight, the name of Goldilocks had stuck. On the 12th night he watched her brush her hair, a mane of curls that stretched halfway down her back, before she slipped out of her clothes and joined him in bed. No shy modesty for her anymore, she wanted his eyes on her almost as much as she wanted to feel his hands and his lips and his tongue. But tonight she knelt on the bed, her hands folded demurely in her lap, hiding the golden curls that tickled his nose when he kissed her in that hidden place between her thighs. "I've been thinking," she began. "Thinking that, you are so kind to me, teaching me about these 1001 ways, but perhaps I should learn at least one. Of the 100. The 100 you mentioned. The 100 ways of pleasing a man?" Bernard finished for her. "I thought you wished to keep your maidenhead." She turned from gold to red. "I do, but if there is a way perhaps I could return a little of the pleasure you have given me without giving up my honor, then I would like to try." Shades of Dulcinea. Bernard wanted to turn her down, but he knew this was not the same. He'd offered to teach Dulcinea, not the other way around. And Ursula didn't just want to practice on him. She wanted to give pleasure to him, like he'd given to her. Could he deny her that? "You could take me in your mouth," he said. Her eyes widened. "It's too long. It won't fit." "Yes, it will. Like all things, there is a trick to it." He started to explain, and after a while she nodded. She cradled him in her hands, and he was just thinking how exquisite her strokes felt along his length, when her mouth engulfed the tip in glorious heat. It was his turn to moan as she slid the length of him down her throat and back out again. The vision of her curly golden head bobbing over his groin, the combination of her lips and tongue and occasionally even her teeth driving him to an impossibly high peak, it all made him wonder if somehow he'd died and gone to heaven. He felt the pressure build, so powerful it was almost painful, that he barely shouted a warning in time. He pulled away from her, catching the mess in a cloth before he spilled his seed in her mouth. She looked hurt. "What did I do wrong?" He could scarcely breathe, the pleasure had been so great. The man who won her for a wife would be a lucky man indeed. "Nothing," he panted. "Nothing. You did everything so perfectly I was quite overcome." He held out the wet cloth in explanation. Understanding dawned in her eyes. "I thought you said you can drink it down." Memories of choking on the stuff rose unbidden into the back of his mind, and Bernard forced them down with a shudder. "You can, but sometimes it comes so fast you can choke." She nodded. "Next time with your warning I will be ready." Next time? He was light-headed at the thought. He'd definitely died and gone to heaven. 29. The weeks passed with freezing cold days and mind-shatteringly hot nights. Every night he spent with her only made him want her more. He never wanted to leave her, and the thought of the coming spring sent daggers through his heart. Impossible though it should be, Bernard was in love with her. And he began to think up ways he might get to keep her, if the lady was willing. His father would surely need someone to govern this place in his stead, and Bernard was his son. None of his other brothers would want the responsibility of a single, tiny valley, when they had so much more. Father might choose to offer one of his knights the honor, Goss, if the man had survived the winter, but Bernard would have to convince him he was the best man for the job. If anything, it would place him far from his father, where he wouldn't disgrace the family anymore. There was the matter of Ursula too, of course. Father would not want to let her live, but if she was married to Bernard, Father might change his mind. Father had to change his mind, for Bernard would die fighting to defend her. 30. Ursula ran up the stairs, barely noticing the weight of her basket. After months of carrying wood up the stairs, her strength had increased so much her arms barely ached at all anymore. Add that to all the snow she'd had to shovel every morning to reach the woodpile in the first place. She was lucky her arms had been thin to start with, or all her gowns would need wider sleeves. "This is the last of the duck confit. I know it's your favorite, so we have eaten a lot of it, but I was sure there were more the last time I looked," she said, then stopped. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" "Getting up," Bernard said. He beckoned her closer. "After 10 weeks, I'm allowed to get out of bed and walk. I'm supposed to do it with a crutch, but unless you can find me one, I hoped you might let me lean on you." She set down her basket and moved to his side. Bernard laid his arm across her shoulders and hoisted himself to his feet. He was a surprisingly light burden until she realized he still had his other arm resting on the bedhead. When he let go, she almost staggered under his weight, but she managed to stay on her feet. How had she not realized how much bigger he was than her? She was lucky he hadn't just flattened her to the floor on the day they first met. "No." Bernard sat down on the bed again. "I'm too much for you to bear. Do you know if there is anything in the castle that might serve as a crutch, or that I might be able to fashion into one? A walking stick or a shepherd's crook? Anything." Ursula thought for a moment. "My grandfather had a walking stick. Big and solid. He used to carry it wherever he went to keep everything in order," he said, "and even the goats would eye it warily, and goats fear nothing. But toward the end, he leaned on it more, especially that last winter. The cold got into his joints," he said, "and froze them solid, just like the river that year. He never saw the spring. I don't remember what happened to that stick, but it was a fine thing. Geoffrey used to call it his scepter of office, like grandfather was a king instead of a mere baron, and say it would be his one day. I wonder." She hurried down the stairs, determined to help Bernard in any way she could. If it weren't for him, she'd have gone mad this winter, all alone. Rats or ghosts, she wasn't sure which, had stolen their stores from the kitchen or the larder, so she'd had to make 2 trips to the deep cellars to see them through the winter. But Geoffrey's chamber, the one just past her father's, she hadn't entered since he died. She pushed the door open with no small amount of trepidation, not knowing what she would find. Not his body surely, for he'd died on the threshold of father's chamber and no doubt been buried with the rest in the churchyard. His bed hadn't been slept in, he'd been awake when the Lord Vauquelin's army arrived then. Perhaps he'd decided to join the guards on the gate, or simply gone for a walk because he could not sleep. Maybe he'd chosen to attend the wedding of Durwood's daughter in town, and he'd run with Durwood to alert the castle, only to arrive too late. Or perhaps he'd been the one to send word to the townspeople, before returning to the castle to discover he'd warned the wrong people. No. The townspeople did not deserve to die while her family lived. She was not so selfish that she'd want that. Whatever Geoffrey had been doing that night he died, he'd carried that secret to his grave. Along with all Father had taught him about being the next Baron of Beehaven. Ursula wished she knew even half of it, but Father had never meant her to be the heir to Beehaven. That's why the books about the history of their home sat here in Geoffrey's room, gathering dust on the table beside his bed. Bernard might like to read them, in between trying to walk again. If only she could find that walking stick. She searched under the bed. She rifled through the chest of clothes Geoffrey would never wear again. It wasn't until she opened the chest that contained his weapons and armor, which she wished he'd been wearing that night, that she found it hiding among a surprisingly large collection of bows. Why Geoffrey had wanted so many bows, Ursula had no idea either. And she would probably never know. She tucked the heavy walking stick under her arm, seized the stack of books, and headed back to the tower. In the tower there was brightness and Bernard and life to be lived. Here there was nothing for her but sorrow. 31. Bernard told Ursula how grateful he was for the walking stick he'd been given, but that was before he'd used it. After 2 days of painfully slow and painfully painful steps crossing the tower room, he was ready to pitch the thing out the window. But he did not. Firstly, because it would be absolutely mortifying to have to ask Ursula to go and retrieve it, after he'd thrown it in a particularly childish tantrum, but also because he knew it was the only way he would ever walk again. Ursula deserved a whole man for a husband. And if he wanted to demonstrate to his father that he was strong enough to hold the barony for him, he didn't dare to appear to be the cripple his father expected. The only thing his father respected was strength, which Bernard sorely needed. So he plodded across the flagstones, then turned and trudged back. Once he'd taken 1,000 steps, he allowed himself a rest, a cup of wine, and the time to read a few pages from one of the books Ursula had brought, A History of the Valley. He felt particularly excited to delve into these books. The King's Library contained books written by occasional visitors to the valley. These were written by the barons themselves, men who had known this place all their lives. Perhaps they even contained the truth behind the miraculous victories the Beehaven armies had won. For Ursula's sake, he wished her father or her brother had known what these books contained, so that his own father would have been driven off. Then again, if they had, he would never have spent the most glorious winter of his life, alone in the castle with her. So in small thanks for her hospitality, he would try to unlock the secrets of Beehaven's invincible immortal army, so that she and her future husband could use them to defend the valley in future. He allowed himself 10 pages, for then the wine cup was empty, and he had the energy to walk again. His long hours in the tower passed quickly now. At first he would stop when Ursula returned, but as his steps grew surer, he forced himself to continue, for the delight in her eyes was worth every painful step. One day, when she headed downstairs, muttering about all the snow she'd have to shovel before she could bring up more wood, he decided it was time to leave the tower room. Not for long, and hopefully not permanently, but he would never leave here at all, unless he could tackle the stairs. So he bundled himself up in his warmest clothes, adding a cloak as much for padding as for warmth, in case he fell, and he opened the door. He rested his weight against the wall as he crept snail-like down the steps. Coming up them that first night, he hadn't noticed quite how steep they were or how uneven. The tight spiral gave him the luxury of leaning his weight against the wall the whole way down, but his leg ached with every new step that thrummed through his freshly healed bones. When he reached the bottom, he was torn between wanting to lie on the floor and rest for a very long time, and the desire to cheer such a momentous achievement. The icy floor offered him little welcome though, and there was no point cheering, if he could not make it back up to the tower room either. Ursula could not lift him, so he would be forced to sleep here, cold and alone and as far from her bed as the moon itself. Not where he wanted to be at all. Whereas if he returned to the tower room under his own power and shared the good news with her on her return, perhaps tonight she would be willing to take him in her mouth again, for she had quickly become so adept at this that he wondered whether he might actually prefer it to the sex act itself. Not that he had shared Ursula's bed with her in that way, of course. He'd promised not to steal her maidenhead, and so it remained intact. His self-control slipped further every night, of course, for she was easily the most ardent lover he'd ever known. Her husband would be a lucky man, he reminded himself. A lucky man he intended would be him. There was an incentive, if ever there was one. No matter how much it hurt, he must ascend the stairs to her chamber if he wanted to share her bed tonight. With renewed determination, Bernard ignored the ache in his legs and their increasingly urgent desire to flop down and never move again, and took the first painful step up toward his heart's desire. 32. When Bernard had managed to make his way down and then up the stairs again, 3 times in the same day without resting, he knew he was ready for more. Venturing outside into the snow and ice to help Ursula bring in fuel for the fire was a bit more ambitious than he had in mind, though. With a walking stick in one hand, he wouldn't be able to carry much wood anyway, he'd be more a hindrance than a help. If he went to the kitchen, he might manage to carry Ursula's basket up the stairs with his free hand. Of course he had to find the kitchen first, but the castle wasn't that big. He'd find it before he had to sit down and rest, surely. The castle couldn't have anything worse than the tower stairs. After only a few wrong turns, he found the kitchen. He would have found it sooner if it had smelled of cooking like any normal kitchen did, but his father was to blame for that. Killing the cooks and whoever else would have worked here, so if Bernard didn't want to do the job, there was no one left who could. He stepped into the room, only to find he wasn't alone. "Goss! I thought you were dead," Bernard exclaimed. Goss chewed and swallowed the chunk of cheese he'd been munching on before he replied, "Almost was. That storm at the beginning of the season? I just managed to take down a deer when I saw it coming in. There was no shelter up in those mountains, so I just grabbed that carcass and came running back here. I left the deer in a drift along the way, when the snow got too thick to see. I missed the town, but nobody can miss a castle. The door to the servants' quarters was open, so I made it in there and holed up for a while. Then I got hungry and found some food I'd missed last time, or that's what I thought. Took me a couple of days to realize we must have missed one of the servants, who knew about a hidden stash that she'd shifted to the larder. I headed up to the tower to check on you, but it sounded like you had the girl eating out of your hand, and you were doing just fine, so I left you to it. She can do all the hard work of taking care of you while I stay out of sight. She doesn't even know I'm here. Pretty little maid too, you're lucky you found her first. I bet she makes a sweet bed warmer." "We're not," Bernard began, horrified. Goss winked. "That's not what it sounded like to me. Besides, if she's not warming your bed, where's she sleeping?" "Not in the servants' quarters. I've been there for weeks and I've had them all to myself." Bernard's shoulders sagged. Despite all his care, he'd still ruined the poor girl's reputation, the only thing she'd had left to lose. More than ever, he needed to marry her. If she'd accept him, the penniless youngest son of the man who'd killed her family. She wouldn't be the first maid to spread her legs in the hope of catching a noble husband. My advice is don't tell her you're Lord Vauquelin's youngest son until your father comes back to collect you. Out here in this backwater, I bet she doesn't know what happened to your last mistress. Killed her in a fit of jealousy, wasn't it? Can't wield a sword to save your life, but you had no problem stabbing your own mistress for sleeping with the king." So Goss had heard the gossip about Dulcinea's death. Better that than the truth. Don't tell her. Please. She'd hate him when she knew. The familiar sound of a load of wood crashing to the floor turned Bernard's heart to ice. "I think it's too late for that, Bernard. He whirled and found himself face to face with a furious Ursula. She pointed at Goss. "Who is he?" Goss performed an extravagant bow. "I am Sir Goss, mistress, one of Lord Vauquelin's sworn knights and tasked with protecting young Bernard here." He straightened and gave her a roguish wink. "If you'd like to know the difference between a man and a boy in bed, I would be delighted to show you." Ursula's normally warm golden eyes turned to chips of amber. "I'd sooner sleep with one of the castle rats than share a bed with either of you. As soon as the snow melts in the pass, I want you both out of here. Until then, you may stay under my roof, but stay out of my way." She turned on her heel and strode away. "Ursula!" Bernard reached for her and knocked over his walking stick. By the time he'd managed to pick it up and start hobbling after her, she was gone. From the bottom of the stairs, he heard the door click shut, before the bar slammed down, locking him out of her chamber and perhaps her heart. He headed back to the kitchen, where Goss had made use of the wood she'd brought in to start a fire in the kitchen grate. "I ate the last of the duck confit last week, but there's still goose," Goss said. "Good larder they kept here." Bernard slumped down on the bench by the table, his head in his hands. Goss had ruined everything. Bernard should have told her the truth the moment they met, and let her cut out his heart then. It would have hurt less than it did now. 33. For some reason, shoveling snow was a whole lot easier this morning than it had been. Oh, Ursula knew she'd been getting better at it as her strength increased, but this was different. Normally she had to crack the layers of ice before she could shovel much of anything, but today it was almost as if the ice had vanished. Or like it had melted away. No, surely not. Her feet were as cold in her boots as any other day she'd been out here. Ursula glanced down, realizing for the first time that her boots were darker than usual, instead of crusted in snow. They were wet, and it was soaking through to her socks. Spring had started. She raced inside, thundering up the stairs to the tower so she could tell Bernard, but he wasn't there. She just stood in the middle of her chamber, shocked, before her mind began to work again. She'd seen him walking more easily every day, so it was only a matter of time before he'd attempt the stairs. She would not have been as patient as he'd been, cooped up in the tower for so long. Her basket was gone, and it made sense that he'd have headed for the kitchen to choose his own cooking supplies for once, so that's the direction Ursula took too. She slowed as she approached the kitchen, for it sounded like Bernard was talking to himself, and she was curious as to what he might say. Until she realized that he was not the one talking at all, there was another man in the kitchen. A man who knew Bernard, his past, and a lot more than she did. So she stood to the side of the door and listened. Lord Vauquelin, a mistress he'd killed. She could not stand in silence anymore. Before she could think it through, Ursula marched into the kitchen, her fury ready to boil over. "Don't tell her, please," Bernard begged the other man. Oh, but it was too late for that. "Who is he?" she demanded, pointing at the stranger whose pointed nose and close-set eyes made her think of a rat. A very large one, who wouldn't have any trouble stealing turnips or comfits or cheeses. Bernard appeared to have lost the power of speech, so the rat man spoke for him, introducing himself as one of Lord Vauquelin's knights, as he looked her up and down like she was a piece of meat. Then he had the audacity to invite her to his bed. Ursula wanted to vomit. Worse, she'd allowed Bernard to share her bed, when he was little better than the sneak thief who'd stolen her food and lived under her roof for weeks. They'd probably been swapping secrets about the castle, planning to tell Lord Vauquelin when he returned, so that the bastard could rob her of everything she had left. She'd been so stupid. Her father was right, men were not to be trusted. She made a cutting reply and hurried out before her tears could fall. She'd been so ready to give her heart to Bernard, but he probably would have stabbed it, like he had the last girl he'd seduced. Ursula stomped up the stairs, wishing she'd actually pushed him down the stairs on the day they met, instead of him falling. Then maybe he would have broken his head and died instead of breaking her heart. 34. Bernard didn't know what to do. He'd come down to surprise her with a nice dinner, and thanks to Goss, he'd lost her. He could still make her dinner, he decided. After all, Ursula had precious little food upstairs, and she didn't know how to cook whatever she had. Perhaps that would soften her heart toward him, a little. Enough to let him apologize for not telling her who his father was. Maybe even enough so that she'd let him tell her the truth about Dulcinea, for not even the king himself knew the whole story. He took hours putting together the best ingredients for a stew, letting it simmer until it tasted perfect. He carried the pot upstairs, then knocked on her door over and over, but he got no answer. Was she even inside? He tried the door, but it was still barred from the inside. "Ursula, please let me in. I'm sorry. I brought you dinner." No response. "I don't know what you heard down there, but I swear to you, it's not true." The door flew open and the harpy stood there, seething. "It's not true that you're Lord Vauquelin's son?" she demanded. She was going to pitch him down the stairs to his death this time, he was sure of it. Best that he give her the stew pot first. Bernard held out the pot as a peace offering. "I am Lord Vauquelin's son," he admitted. "But—" She snatched the pot out of his hand, then slammed the door and dropped the bar across it again. Bernard sighed. Then he headed down to the kitchen to make a second dinner, for his first one, much like the woman he loved, was beyond his reach. 35. Day after day, Bernard limped up to her door, knocking and apologizing, before he gave up and left a pot on the top step. She'd given in and opened the door the first time, but seeing the anguish on his face as he lied to her had driven her nearly mad. She'd wanted to push him down the steps, or turn him into something slimy and execrable, so instead of the handsome man who'd stolen her heart, he would look like his true self. But he was Lord Vauquelin's son, and if she used magic on him, no one would want to marry the witch woman of Beerhaven, for he would be sure to tell everyone he knew. So she waited until she heard the thump-click of his walking stick fade into the distance, before she dared to open the door and snatch up what was always a delicious dinner. She didn't understand. He was healed, and his father would soon come to take him away, and everything else he hadn't been able to steal before winter set in. Why would Bernard even want to get back into her good graces? For weeks he'd fooled her into thinking he was the most perfect, most honorable man she'd ever met, when he was really the murderous son of another murderer. Like father, like son after all. She didn't understand men at all. So when Bernard came knocking again, she swore she wouldn't let him in or speak to him ever again. 36. Bernard carried a new pot up the stairs, trying to keep the other bundle from sliding out from under his arm as he knocked on her door. "Ursula, sweet Ursula, I'm sorry. I swear I've never lied to you. Every word I've told you is the truth." No answer, as always. He wondered why he bothered trying. Surely she'd heard his apologies and decided not to accept them. But he could not let her starve, so he brought her food, and each time he hoped. "It's a venison stew with the last of the chestnuts. Fresh venison frozen in the snow. Goss caught the deer, and I saved the best of it for you." Bernard held his breath. Still nothing. "And there's bread. It's taken me all week to work out how to make it. I wasted a lot of flour and it's still not perfect, but it's real bread this time. Soft inside with a crust on the outside, just like it should be. I know how much you've been wanting some." Only silence greeted him. Bernard sighed and stooped to set the food on the step, as always. He turned and made his laborious way down the steps again. "How can I believe you?" Bernard turned so fast he lost his balance. Luckily he fell up the stairs instead of down them this time, but not without bashing his barely healed leg. He swore. Then Ursula was there, trying and failing to pull him up, for her slight strength was nowhere near enough to lift him. "Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes wide with worry. Bernard had never grinned so widely. He barely noticed the pain anymore. "I am now. Let me in, and I swear I will tell you anything you wish to know." "How can I believe you, after you lied to me?" He cupped her cheek in his hand so that he could meet her eyes. "Ursula, I swear on my life, I have never lied to you. There are things I haven't told you, but everything I have told you is the truth." She stared at him for a long moment, until finally, she nodded. "Fine. You may come in, but if I find you have lied to me, I shall throw you down the stairs, and this time there won't be a miracle to save you, for we both know you will not deserve it." "That was fair." "As you wish, my lady." She took a few steps back, then pointed at the big chair by the window. "You can sit there." She sat on the bed, drawing her knees up to her chest. Bernard crossed the room and took the seat that was offered. "What would you like to know?" "Start with the beginning. Why were you here in the tower?" Bernard swallowed. This was the answer that would get him kicked down those stairs again, he was certain of it. "That's not the beginning. The beginning is what you want to know. Do you remember when I told you about Dulcinea, the king's mistress?" he asked. Ursula's eyes narrowed. "That's not what the rat knight in the kitchen said. He said the girl was your mistress, and you killed her. You told me you'd never killed anyone in your life, so I know you lied to me." Bernard shook his head. "I never lied to you. I have never killed anyone." "So she's alive then, this mistress of yours?" He sighed. "No. Dulcinea is dead. For all that I didn't kill her, I did watch the light fade from her eyes as she died, holding her in my arms until there was more of her blood on me than left in her. I may as well have killed her, for if I had not done what I did, the poor girl might still be alive. Miserable but alive." "Explain." Bernard took a deep breath. When the king returned from his most unholy crusade, he was convinced his place in heaven was assured. He could do no wrong. So when he decided to take a nobleman's daughter as his mistress, he believed it was his right. Her father gave her up as easily as my father did me, because that's the thing about kings, you can't refuse them anything because that would be treason. So he took the girl, a maiden like you, and for want of a better word, raped her as brutally as he had any of us boys. In the middle of the night, he tossed her out of his room because he couldn't stand the sound of her sobbing. She was naked and bleeding, and I knew exactly how she felt. We'd all been there, but there'd been a fraternity among the king's pages that we would help each other, share the burden and the tricks we learned to make things easier. When the king chose her, he had no need for us, so the other boys, men by then for the crusade took many years, were enjoying a night off. I'd been forced to stay to show the palace cooks how to prepare the king's new favorite foods, and was on my way back to my chamber when I found her, all alone. So I helped her. Took her to the tiny chamber that was mine, helped her wash and tended her wounds. She slept in my bed, while I lay on the floor. And in the morning, I started to teach her the ways I showed you. The ways to pleasure a man. So she became your mistress as well as the king's, Ursula said slowly. Bernard shook his head violently. No. She was never mine. Some of the things I showed her could only be demonstrated on the actual body parts involved though, so there were times when she touched me intimately because she wanted to know what she was doing before she dared to suggest them to the king. If she hurt me by mistake, it wouldn't matter, but if she accidentally bit or scratched the king. Understanding dawned in Ursula's eyes, quickly replaced by horror. That's what she did, isn't it? She did something wrong and he ordered her death. If only it was that simple. In her isolated valley, Ursula had never known the tangled web that was court politics, and Bernard hoped she never would. She was too sweet for court. No, for Dulcinea was a quick learner, and she knew her life depended on her pleasing the king. No, the king retired early and summoned her when she was still with me, attempting to, oh, never mind. It doesn't matter now. When she didn't answer his summons, he came to her chamber to drag her out, and he found us together. He'd been inspecting the army that day, so he had a sword at his hip. He drew it and killed her. He just stood there watching her die, not doing a thing to help her. Then he held out his sword and told me to clean the blade. The moment I took the sword, he called for his guards and spun a tale about how I had been in love with the girl, but had killed her out of jealousy when the king himself chose her to be his queen. It was all a lie, she was his whore. He'd never intended to make her his wife. But it placated the duke, her father, who loudly mourned the girl he called their lost queen for far longer than any man mourns a lost child. But his rise in favor came at a cost. I'd dishonored my family and made an enemy of the duke, who had formerly been an ally of my father's. If the envoy from King Seward had not come to court, I think I might have been tried and hanged for a murder I did not commit. But with all the excitement over the lost kingdom and all, the murder was hushed up and I was pardoned, though not before my father had to hand over a great deal of money to the duke, as he told me daily all the way here. He longed to look at her face, but he didn't dare. He wasn't sure what he'd do if she didn't believe him. So why are you here? My father told me if I wasn't useful to him, if I didn't find a way to pay him back all the gold he'd lost because of me, then he'd send me back to the king and have me tried, before publicly disowning me as his son. You told him to conquer Beer Haven. That's how you plan to repay him? With our gold? Bernard bowed his head. I did. I believed the army here was a force to be reckoned with based on what I'd read, and that father couldn't possibly win. While we marched, I tried to learn to fight, but I was terrible with a sword, the laughing stock of the whole camp. So I knew father wouldn't want me to fight, and he would lose and either die or retreat. I intended to slip away from the camp with whatever coin I could carry to start a new life. And with him gone, I would be free. Free to find my own way or fight as a knight like Sir Goss or something. Anything else. But then father told me to come up here and secure the Maiden's Tower because I was good at killing girls, and I could not refuse him. And when you woke, you found your father had won, Ursula finished for him. I don't understand. All the texts in the king's library said the army here was unbeatable. Even the history books from here say the same. Well, if you take away the fanciful accounts of immortal bears. The barons here called their men here bears, but the way your books describe them, they are merely normal men, fierce fighters who wear bearskins into battle. I mean, one was a baker according to one of your ancestors. Here, let me find the passage. Bernard reached for the book and flipped through the pages until he found it. Here it is. Peck slew the most men this battle, collecting more than a dozen swords and a fine axe which belonged to Lord Trumbauer that now has pride of place over the oven in his bakehouse. An army of bears. Ursula said slowly. Bernard laughed. So the accounts say, from the men they defeated. I suppose it is less cowardly to be beaten in battle by a bear who slew 50 men, than by a man wearing a bearskin. But Ursula wasn't laughing. Instead, she was staring intently at him as if measuring his soul. Your father will return for you when the snow melts, right? She asked. If I could disown my father, I would. After all he has done here, and if leaving me here to die is any indication, he has most certainly washed his hands of me. I'm nothing like him, Ursula, I swear it. He ordered his men to slaughter children in their beds. Ordered me to kill you. He is no kin to me, though he will likely order me to leave with him. She sighed. Fine. Vauquelin will return then. With his army, I presume. Bernard nodded. Most likely. Then if we are to survive, if I am to survive, I will need an army to match his. Bernard shook his head. You'd need the mythical army from the stories. Even I dare not oppose him. If he calls, I must obey, for I am only one man against an army. An army who obeys him." She bit her lip. "What if I told you I do have such an army?" Bernard burst out laughing. "Then I wouldn't believe you. It's a myth, Ursula. One I wish was true, but it cannot be. When my father returns, you must hide in the same place you did before, so that he cannot find you. And know that wherever he makes me go, my heart will always be here with you. If there is ever a time I am free of him, I will return here, to Beerhaven, to claim my heart." She tilted her head to the side. "Are you saying you love me, Bernard?" He seized her hand and pressed it over his heart. "With every heartbeat, every breath, yes, I love you, Ursula. And if I lost you, I'm not sure my heart would wish to keep beating. Would you marry me?" He blinked. "I thought it was my job to ask such questions, but I admit I have not, because I have little to offer you. I am a younger son, with no inheritance to speak of, little prowess with a sword or any other weapon, all of which would make me a poor husband. Your skills in the kitchen and the bedchamber have proved more use to me than anything you could do with a sword." Ursula blushed. "And as a husband you would show you every single one of those 1,001 ways, or at least the ones I remember. Especially the ones that are also in that much shorter list of 100 ways for a man, for then the pleasure is shared." Desire left his mouth dry. He wanted to reach for her, to take her in his arms, lay her on the bed and start now. "It is my most ardent wish to take you as my bride." She rose from the bed. "Then bar the door. Tonight, I wish you to show me what sort of husband you will be. And on the morrow, I will decide whether to show you the secrets of Beerhaven." 37. As Bernard crossed the floor to lift the bar across the door, Ursula made for the fire. She threw a couple of logs onto the blaze, heedless of the sparks that spat, as the two lay together atop the coals. She would do this. She would give herself to Bernard, because she loved him and wanted him, and he was the man she chose to share her nights with. She no longer needed a husband with a strong army to defend them, if it was true what he said about bears. Because if the tales were true, then she had an army of her own far greater than anything Lord Vauquelin could field. But that was for tomorrow. Tomorrow she would wake the townspeople and ask them to fight. But tonight was for Bernard, a man who was more lover than fighter. A man who said he loved her. Ursula unlaced her gown, then her shift, and let both slide to the floor. She toed off her stockings, knowing Bernard's mysterious ways worked best skin on skin with nothing between them. When he turned, his eyes darkened with desire, devouring her even from across the room. Instinct told her to cover herself, but Ursula kept her arms by her sides. If she had her way, Bernard would touch every part of her tonight, so he should get to see it all first. A shiver of pleasure coursed through her at the very thought. "You'll freeze like that, Goldilocks," he said, crossing the room to take her in his arms. He paused to give her a searing kiss, before lifting her off her feet. "Let's get you into bed." The sheets were cool beneath her, but they would not be cold for long. Bernard crept into bed beside her, pulling the covers over the top of them, as he settled between her parted legs. "You're still dressed," she complained, reaching for the buttons on his doublet. Bernard pushed her hand away. "My lady's pleasure comes first, especially when it is her first time." His other hand caressed her thigh, stroking ever upward until he slid a finger inside her, planting his thumb exactly where he knew she wanted it. All week she'd craved his touch, and now it seemed her flesh flamed into life to feel him again. It seemed mere seconds before she arched her back and cried out his name. Her back had barely touched the sheet again before she felt something warm and wet between her legs, and she gasped in surprise as she found he'd replaced his hand with his mouth. No, not replaced, she thought as his hands coaxed her to open her legs wider to give his tongue better access. Using a combination of his fingers and his mouth, he claimed her body so completely she could think of nothing else but him. He pushed her to a peak more slowly this time, relishing each stroke as though he loved the taste. Then he slid another finger inside her, sucking just a little harder than before, and she fell apart with a scream. Stars filled her vision, making it hard to breathe. When she could see again, she found Bernard had taken off his tunic and doublet, and as he removed his hose, his manhood sprang free. She reached for him, determined to give him as much pleasure as he'd given her. But once again he pushed her hand away, leaning over to kiss her deeply as his fingers slid inside her again. She tried to protest, but the sound was muffled by his kisses, and she was soon lost in the twin sensations of his tongue dancing with hers as his fingers stroked her to even greater heights of pleasure. Ursula felt the release building, arching her back up in anticipation. His thumb circled her slowly, prolonging the moment as his fingers slid out of her, ready for one more thrust. He timed it perfectly, pushing deep into her just as she let out a blissful scream. But this was bigger than a finger, harder and longer, and... "Oh, Bernard," she moaned as the mighty manhood she'd run her tongue along on other blissful nights filled her completely. She never wanted to close her legs again. "Are you all right? You felt ready." She opened her eyes to find him gazing at her with concern. He slid out of her, then rolled to the side to lie on the pillows beside her. Emptiness. No. A moan of loss slipped from her lips. "I'm sorry, I didn't want to hurt you." Ursula managed to get her breathing under control and finally found her voice. "Why did you pull out?" He looked surprised. "You mean I didn't hurt you? I did something right for once?" She almost laughed at the shock on his face. "When it comes to giving pleasure, you've never been wrong. Everything you do in bed is just right." "Then if it doesn't hurt too much, maybe we should try one of those ways that's on both lists." He pulled her over, so that she lay on top of him, her breasts pressed against his chest. They'd never lay like this before, and it felt so sensuous. Ursula rubbed her body against his, enjoying the sensation. Hardness against softness, and the intoxicating combination was just right, like everything he did. "Here, sit up a little," Bernard said, helping her. Ursula straddled him, feeling his manhood hard against her thigh. "I want to feel you inside me again." "That was wonderful," she admitted. "If you're sure." Ursula nodded emphatically. Bernard grasped her hips, positioning her just right as he thrust upward and into her. "Yes." He laughed softly, tracing a finger down her spine as she squirmed, relishing the feeling of fullness again. His fingers tangled in her braid, unraveling it as she began to move, rocking her hips. "My God, you're perfect, Goldilocks," he said, matching her timing with a rhythm of his own. Some vague thought in the back of her mind said she should thank him for the compliment, but the time for words and conscious thought was over. There was nothing else in the world but her body and his, and how perfectly they fit together. 38. When morning came, Bernard wished it away, for such a blissful night could only have been a dream. Yet when he opened his eyes, Ursula lay in the bed beside him, her legs tangled with his and her possessive hand on his already eager-to-please cock. He blew out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. It had all been real. Ursula screaming his name as she straddled him, that golden mane of curls bouncing around her as she rode him, arching her back to place her breasts close enough for him to kiss. He wanted to wake her up to do it all again, but he knew better than anyone to be cautious. For last night passion had definitely overridden caution, and she would surely be aching this morning. Why he was aching, but that was his leg, and that was normal. "Bernard?" Ursula sat up, her hair a tangled halo around her face. "Oh good. I was afraid it was all a dream." He chuckled. "I thought the same, yet here we are. If only we could stay abed forever, but alas, we cannot. For we are not married yet, not truly, and we must be," she said. As soon as the snow in the pass melts, I will travel with you to the nearest priest, and I will be yours, Bernard promised. This did not seem to satisfy her. What if I told you there was a priest here in the valley, who might be able to marry us today? Bernard relaxed in relief. Even better. I fear it would be a slow journey otherwise, for we have no horses. She wet her lips. Then we should dress, for there is much to do today. She sat up, wincing as the cold air hit her bare skin. As my lady wishes, of course. By the time Ursula fastened her cloak, he barely managed to put his tunic on over his hose. She stood at the door, looking torn. He was loath to admit weakness, but his leg pained him particularly badly this morning. Go and rouse your priest from his hiding place. I will be in the kitchen, keeping an eye on Goss to make sure he does not follow you, and I will have your breakfast ready on your return. The doubt clouding her eyes cleared in a moment. Truly? He grimaced as he stood up. Truly? Though you should know, if you marry me, you are marrying a cripple. I fear my leg may never heal the same as it was, and even walking swiftly will be more than I can manage. Only half a man when you deserve a whole one. She crossed the room to stand before him. You are more than man enough for me, Bernard, as you showed me last night. And if you walk with a limp, who is to blame more than me, for 'twas I who injured you in the first place? I love the man you are and no one else. She stretched up to kiss him, pressing her body against him as she had last night. If only their clothes would vanish. Bernard forced the thought out of his mind. There would be time enough for such things later, when they were properly married. Last night should not have happened, but he could not bring himself to regret the blissful hours of having her in his arms. I shall return, she said, laughing as she swept out of the room. 39. More than once, Ursula glanced over her shoulder to make sure the rat knight did not follow her. She trusted Bernard, but it would take him some time to make his way from the tower to the kitchen, and if Sir Goss took it into his head to follow her. In a week, the snow had melted so much there were clear patches on the ground and the streams were full. It was time to wake the sleepers before Vauquelin arrived. She stopped at the church, going inside to light candles. She stayed there for some time until she was sure she had not been followed, before rising to her feet and setting off for the cave where her people slept. Higher and higher Ursula climbed, and more than once she had to step carefully where the path had become a meltwater stream. Finally, she arrived at the cave where she'd last seen her people. She stepped inside, letting her eyes adjust to the dark before going in any further. Large furry lumps lay everywhere just as they had when she'd left. But there were differences between these bears and the three she'd first shared a cave with, the night her family died. The townspeople had stretched out on pallets, pulling blankets over them that did little to cover them. She knelt by the ashes of the fire to lay a new one, marveling as the tiny flame lit up the whole cave. A growl from the darkness turned the blood in her veins to ice. Had a real bear crept into the cave during the winter, one who would attack whoever woke it? She bit her lip, tasting blood. It was a long time since she'd cast a spell, but this one came naturally, leaving her lips and drifting over the sleepers like the first flurry of snow. Or the warm spring breeze, melting everything it touched. Would it be enough? She turned them one at a time before, but now she knew the spell, it seemed simpler to just cast the one to encompass them all. She held her breath for a moment, until the bears began to transform. Only then did she dare let the breath whoosh out of her, relief that she'd done this right. But that's what Bernard had told her, though not in as many words last night. Turning the people of Behaven into bears and back again came naturally to the people of her bloodline. When the only furry mound remaining was a family of children huddled beneath the same fur cloak, they started to wake. Slowly at first, then all at once the townspeople came back to life. Is it spring already? Pan the baker asked, stretching. Why, I feel like I only just lay down to sleep. Ursula nodded. 'Tis 3 months since I bespelled you all, and you have slept through the winter. The snow is melting, and it is only a matter of time before the passes reopen. And when they do, Lord Vauquelin will return to finish what he started when he slaughtered my family." "Then why did you change us back?" Pan rumbled. "I've always wanted to wield my grandfather's axe. It's been in my family as long as I can remember, too big for any normal man to lift, but a bear." "Was your grandfather Peck the baker, who slew 50 men in a single battle?" Ursula blurted out. "No, that was his father. My grandfather was Pecco." She took a moment to collect her scattered thoughts. She'd thought the tales were merely stories, while her people knew them for the truth they contained. "Would you fight to defend the valley?" "Give me back my claws and I'll put old Peck to shame," Pan said. Cries of support came from all sides, asking for claws. The menfolk all wanted to defend their home, and some of the women too. Even children added their shouts to the clamor. Ursula made a swift decision. "Very well. I shall cast a spell on you all, every man and woman in the valley, so that when there is a threat to the valley, you may turn into bears to defend it, and your families. Anyone who wishes me to lift the spell on them may tell me, and I shall do it at once." It was but the work of a moment to cast the spell, but she would not know if it had worked until Vauquelin arrived. If it had not, then it would be too late. Alika unpacked the basket of food Ursula had brought, portioning out tasks to the other women until a cauldron of stew bubbled over the fire, with a smaller pot of porridge beside it. While the others ate, Ursula sought out Father Jacques. She found him sitting close to the cave entrance with a book on his lap, making the most of a beam of sunlight that had seen fit to enter the cavern. Ursula sank to her knees. "Father, I must ask your help on a private matter," she said. He glanced at the others, but the townspeople were too busy eating breakfast to pay attention to them. "What is it, Lady Ursula?" She twisted the corner of her cloak in her hands. "I wish you to marry me." He smiled indulgently. "I realize you have spent a long winter alone, but surely it has not addled your wits. Priests are not permitted to marry." She blinked, taking a moment to understand what he meant. "No, I don't want you to marry me." "Well, I do want you to, but, while you were all asleep, I met a man the soldiers had left behind. He was a soldier of sorts too, though he did not do any fighting. He was grievously wounded and left behind to die. I nursed him back to health and we became fond of one another. So fond that I have decided to make him my husband, and in Father's absence the Baron of Beerhaven. Beerhaven will need a strong man to lead it, and I wish to be married as soon as possible. Before Vauquelin returns. Today." Father Jacques eyed her with suspicion. "Today, hum? You know, a quick marriage is usually the sign of a guilty conscience. What have you been doing while we slept, Lady Ursula? How long has it been since your last confession? Or your last moonblood?" His eyes fixed on her belly as if he could see it twisting itself in knots at his words. "Moonblood? Father, I have not." Ursula stopped when she remembered the bliss she'd known last night, and her cheeks colored. She could be with child, Bernard's child, for she was a maiden no longer. "Father, I need a husband, a baron to lead the army of Beerhaven to war. Lord Vauquelin would not listen to me." He raised his eyebrows. "With the legendary bear army of Beerhaven at your back, I think most men, even great lords, would give you their full attention. But there is the succession to think about. If you are the last of your father's line, you must have children. Come to me in the church at sunset tomorrow, and bring the man you hope to make your husband. This is Beerhaven, and the people will not accept a baron who is not worthy of them. Especially not when they have a baroness like yourself, to lead them already." "But I am just—" "You are the baron's blood, and you saved us all. Your soldier, who is he? Does he belong to Lord Vauquelin?" Ursula bit her lip and nodded. A man who is not one of us, who fought against us. If you insist, I will perform the ceremony for the sake of your child, so that you might have a legitimate heir, but as soon as the ceremony is over, your husband will have a fight on his hands. For if he is a traitor and a danger to the valley, he will find himself torn apart by an army of angry bears." "I will tell him," she said with a sinking heart. When Bernard found out, there was no way he'd marry her. No man would now. Not if it meant death by bears. 40. "I'm ready, so I will go ahead. I'm sure it's customary for the groom to arrive first, and for the bride to be late," Bernard said. Ursula let her breath out in an angry hiss. "If my brothers weren't already dead, I would want to kill them all over again. What possessed them to put mice in the chest with my best dresses? I have nothing to wear to my own wedding." She scooped up the shredded silk gowns and dumped them back in the chest. He stepped forward and folded her into his arms. "Whatever you wear, you will be the most beautiful woman there, and the only one I see. That very first day you appeared by my bedside, I thought you an angel." Ursula squinted up at him. "I thought you said you thought I was a harpy." He stroked her hair, like he did after they made love. "So soothing. That day doesn't count. I meant the day you told me to get out of your chamber, when you tried to make porridge." "This one?" Ursula held up Alika's golden brown dress and shook it. "Yes, that one. You don't know how many nights I dreamed about taking that dress off you. It would give me great pleasure to actually get to do it on our wedding night." Ursula couldn't help but laugh. "You're a fool, Bernard. I don't know why you agreed to marry me, especially after I told you about the bears. I would face down an entire army of bears for you, Goldilocks. The only thing that scares me is losing you." Then they kissed, and Ursula did not want to stop. Nor did Bernard, it seemed, but he was the one to break it. "I'd best get to the church, because if I kiss you for much longer, the only place I'll be going with you is to bed." He blew her a kiss before heading down the stairs. Ursula watched him go, pressing her fingers to her lips to savor the feeling of his kiss for a moment longer. She worried for him, even if he did not. If her people found out he wasn't just some ordinary soldier but Lord Vauquelin's son. She closed her eyes, willing the panic to subside. She couldn't lose him. Wouldn't lose him. The moment someone turned into a bear, she'd turn him into something that ate bears. A lion, maybe. Or something small and swift so he could run and hide. Or a bird who could fly away. She slipped the brown dress over her head, giving it an extra brush, but it didn't help. It was worn thin after she'd worn it so much through the winter, and it looked duller than ever. But if this was what Bernard wanted, then she would wear it. She'd wear a man's tunic and hose if he asked it of her. Or nothing at all. That made her smile, for he would ask that later. She tied the laces, then slipped on her best winter boots. Those at least no mice had gotten to. Ursula took her time with her hair, combing it carefully before winding two small braids about her head like a crown to keep the rest in check, as it ran like the river down her back. Just the way Bernard liked it. She had no jewels to speak of, for Vauquelin's soldiers had stolen her mother's jewel casket along with everything else, and it was too early for flowers. This would have to do. Ursula flung a cloak around her shoulders, pinning it closed as she hurried down the stairs. She hadn't realized how late it was. The sun was already sinking behind the cliffs, and it would be dark by the time she reached the church. The building was alight with candles, though, glowing like a beacon in the otherwise dark town, for everyone was inside the church tonight. Ursula paused at the door, as much to calm her fluttering heart as to remove her cloak, which someone took from her. The crowd parted, turning to see her as she walked from the door to the altar, where Bernard and Father Jacques waited. Ursula took a deep breath and stepped forward. One foot in front of the other, steadily advancing, and trying not to think that every step she took brought Bernard closer to a horrible death. A possible death, she reminded herself. If the people of Beerhaven saw him as she did, they could not raise a hand against him. Whatever else he was, Bernard was a good man. People shuffled back, making space for her before closing in behind her again. She wished she could see Bernard, for if she could meet his eyes, nothing would keep her from coming to him. Nothing and no one. So she continued the longest walk of her life, knowing what waited for her at the end. Finally it ended, as the only person between her and the altar was Father Jacques. She stood before him, turning to her right, then her left, looking for the man who had to be here. But she came up empty. "Father, where is Bernard?" she asked. Father Jacques shook his head. "I do not know. No one has seen a stranger here, not in the church, or anywhere in town." That kiss. That wonderful, longing kiss. It hadn't been a promise at all. It had been farewell. A lump welled up in her throat. It was their wedding day. Bernard had promised. He'd promised to be here. And yet, he was gone. Ursula fell to her knees and wept. 41. Bernard made his way carefully down the steps to the courtyard outside. It was strange to think he hadn't set foot outside the castle in months, but it looked like very little had changed. The snow had just started falling then, and there were only small patches of it left now. He hadn't seen the village then, but in the golden afternoon light, it seemed a pleasant enough place. He had to follow the road through it to reach the church carved into the cliffs, Ursula had said, and that's precisely what he intended to do. He carried no weapon, not even his sword, because it tangled with his walking stick and threatened to trip him. Heaven knew he had enough trouble walking without falling over again. Not to mention Ursula would be mortified to marry a man covered in mud. Today she would become his. She'd chosen him to be her husband, and that made him the luckiest man alive. Bernard held his head high as he strode toward town. Too high perhaps, for he tripped, stumbled and fell. Cursing his own clumsiness, Bernard started to climb to his feet, only to find a sword tip a few inches from his nose. "Get up and get on the horse or I'll kill you myself," Goss growled. With difficulty Bernard rose, lifting his hands into the air to signal his surrender. "Really, Sir Goss, this isn't necessary. I'm only going to the church. It is the duty of every man, after all. Not through that village, you're not. I'm not giving them a hostage. Your father would kill me, and rightly so. So get on the horse and you get to live." He jingled the bridle he held in his other hand. Bernard stared. "Where did you find the animal?" It looked eerily like the gelding he'd ridden here on, all those months ago. But it couldn't be. Father had taken it home with him, loaded down with whatever he'd stolen from Ursula and her family. He hadn't even left Goss's horse here, for Goss had complained bitterly about it in those first days. In the camp, picketed with the others, of course. Where else does an army keep its horses? Goss bared his teeth. "Now for the last time, get on the damn horse or I'll gut you myself, load your body onto his back and tell your father I was too late to save you." Bernard swallowed. He knew it was too good to be true. He'd never escape his father. And Ursula, better that he got Goss out of here before she came down the road, for who knew what Goss would do to her. He lifted his foot into the stirrup, wincing as he swung his leg over the horse, forcing his injured leg to take his full weight for a moment before he settled in the saddle. Goss was quicker, bringing his horse alongside Bernard's so that the moment Bernard relaxed, he'd roped Bernard's hands together and tied them to his own saddle. "There," Goss said. "If you even think of riding off, you'll be off your horse and dragging behind mine before you come to your senses." Bernard summoned the glare he'd learned at court. "Just because you have no honor does not mean I suffer from the same affliction. I keep my word." Goss laughed so hard he almost doubled over. "You? Didn't you just promise to meet that whore of yours in the village? You're already forsworn, you fool. Cowards like you have no honor. If you were my son I would not have let you live, but Lord Vauquelin is a kinder man than I will ever be." Bernard did not rise to the insult, for it was no more than he deserved. Ursula, no, let Goss think she was a commoner and not the rightful heir to the valley. If her bear army truly existed, he had no doubt she would command it with all the courage of her ancestors. And if he died in the crossfire, he would die happy, for he'd shared this winter with her and some of the happiest nights of his life. She deserved vengeance and he deserved to be free. He would prefer to share his freedom with her, but if death was the only way his father allowed him to escape, he would take it. That had been his original plan, after all. He stiffened his spine as he arrived at the edge of his father's camp, ignoring the stares and jeers as the soldiers watched him pass. The man who'd been defeated by a maiden. Bernard allowed himself a smug smile. He'd challenge any of them to have done things differently. She'd conquered him so utterly he no longer cared what common soldiers thought. "So you're not dead," his father greeted him. "And Sir Goss did not have to dig your grave after all. Goss also tells me we did not kill everyone, so this time we will be more thorough. And then Goss will have his reward. Do you fancy this valley, Sir Goss?" Goss shrugged. "The hunting is not so bad. They make good cheese and the goose is tolerable. But I am no farmer, my lord. I would prefer to fight at your side than be banished to such a backwater for any longer than necessary. One winter was enough for a lifetime." Lord Vauquelin laughed. "Well said. Who would you recommend I give it to then, Goss?" Goss opened his mouth but Bernard got in first. "I wouldn't mind it, father," he said. "I'm fond of cheese." "You?" Vauquelin sneered. "You should have kept your sword in its sheath and continued to obey the king, so you could stay at court. Only a man as weak as a woman would stab someone in a fit of jealousy. So she stole your lover and your place in the king's bed. Pa! A proper man would have bided his time and seized the chance to claim his rightful place when the king tired of her, but not you. You're a fool and I should have left you to die under the executioner's axe." He nodded in the direction of the village. "Or maybe I should hand you over to the villagers, and let them stab you to death with their pitchforks. It would give me an excuse to go in and slaughter them all, not that I need it." Bernard prayed Ursula had found her army or a hiding place no one would find. "I'm sure you will do as you please, with no concern for me. By all means see what the people of Beerhaven do when they are attacked openly instead of stabbed while they lie in their beds." He leaned forward. "Or are you afraid of bears, father?" "The bears are a myth. I never saw a single one all winter," Goss scoffed. Bernard snorted. "Of course not. Bears hibernate, you dolt." With his wrists tied together, he couldn't block the blow Goss aimed at his head. For a moment his ears rang with it, but it was worth it to see the look on Goss's face. The knight would have happily left him to die, if not for Ursula. "Enough. In the morning we march on the village, and this time we leave no survivors. Those who manage to hide in the dark will find no quarter in the bright light of day." Father waved for a servant. "Find my son somewhere to sleep. He will stay by my side tomorrow and watch." "Wonderful." Bernard was led off, wishing he was anywhere but here. 42. Only one thing could drag Ursula out of despair. "There's an army camped at the entrance to the pass. Lord Vauquelin has returned." Ursula raised her head to see the wide-eyed boy before he shouted the news again. "How many?" Pan demanded, grabbing the boy's arm. "More than us," the boy said, twisting free. "I dunno." With a nod, Pan dispatched 2 men to investigate. Bernard had gone with them, like he'd planned all along. No wonder he hadn't cared what she wore to the wedding. He'd never intended to attend. The men returned within the hour, bringing word that the army was less than 100 strong, with only a couple of knights. The camp showed signs of settling down for the night, talking loudly about their plans to attack in the morning. Pan nodded. Then tonight we hide and tomorrow we fight. 100 of them is nothing. As long as we can field 10 men strengthened by Lady Ursula's gift, we cannot do anything but win. He pointed at 4 men. You take turns, keep watch on the camp. If they look like moving, sound the alarm. We will be ready. Ursula found her voice. But they have armor and weapons. Even as bears, you are vulnerable to attack. Better for us all to hide until they are gone. With all respect, my lady, we're done hiding. We have arms and armor, and now we have you, we can't lose. She stared at the baker. How? Who makes armor big enough for bears? And where would you keep it? Pan grinned. Why, Bear's Head Rock, my lady. My great-grandfather was made armor master after that last glorious battle, and the job passed down to me. You won't find a speck of rust on my watch, I promise you. Ursula watched in a daze as she was shepherded up to the caves with the other women, and the men returned with the fabled armor that lived up to Pan's claims. She passed the night in restless sleep with everyone else, waiting for a call to arms that never came. Dawn sneaked into the cave slowly, washing the sleeping people in its grey light as they woke, and started breaking their fast with the supplies someone had brought from the castle kitchens. The sun had barely cleared the cliffs before Pan stood up and stretched. They're coming. It's time, he said. The stretch seemed to go on, and his body grew in size. Double, triple, until the man's furry head nearly touched the ceiling. Pan as a man was imposing enough, but as a bear, he would have weighed half a ton, able to take off a man's head with one swipe of his mighty paw. Ursula let out a breath she hadn't been holding. The spell she'd cast worked, better than she'd believed possible. All around her, men were following Pan's example, turning into bears, then buckling on armor for all the world like they were just particularly hairy men. Can you understand me? Ursula asked Pan. The huge bear grinned, flashing a mouth full of fangs, and nodded. Then he growled something that sounded like a question, but she didn't understand any of it. Another bear grinned and nodded at Pan. All the bears were nodding at whatever Pan had said. I don't know what you said, Ursula said. One of the smaller bears shrank back into a man Ursula recognized as the stable boy who'd broken his leg. So he wasn't dead after all. He said he intends to smash his great-grandfather's record, mistress, and kill even more men with Peck's axe. His face vanished behind a furry muzzle once more. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. This was their home, and they chose to fight for it, with the best weapons and armor she and their ancestors could provide. Ursula only hoped it would be enough. When her army marched out, she went with them. Pan tried to tell her, with much pointing and waving, to go back to the other women and children, but he was not the only one who was done hiding. She flashed her teeth in a snarl as fierce as any bear's, though probably not as frightening. If you can understand me, Pan, then know this, the gift that turns you into bears works in many ways. I don't just do bears. I turned my brothers into mice once, and if the battle turns bad, you will need me. This is my fight too. The bear considered her words, then bowed deeply. No one tried to send her back after that. When the army reached the fork that led to the castle and the pass, they stopped. Ursula, who had fallen behind, had to push her way through furry, steel-strapped bodies to reach the front line. What is it? She asked. She needn't have bothered. She could see Lord Vauquelin's camp now, blocking the road to the pass. His troops were spilling out of the camp, forming up into orderly lines for battle. A battle her men, no her bears, would give them. Where is Lord Vauquelin? She asked. Pan turned and pointed, not at the camp but at the castle. Fury exploded in Ursula's chest as she saw Lord Vauquelin standing on the battlements of her castle, peering out over the gate. On either side of him were 4 men in total. 3 armored knights, and Bernard wearing the same clothes he'd left the tower room in yesterday. She'd never seen Bernard look so miserable. "Keep the army busy. Their commander is mine," she hissed, heading back the way she'd come. "And if any man harms the unarmed man standing at Lord Vauquelin's side, he will answer to me." Pan nodded, then issued a growling order to his men. Ursula didn't need to understand. War was not something she knew, but betrayal and justice? The only decision she had to make was whether to turn Lord Vauquelin into a rat, or a cockroach. Or perhaps a slug. She had a long walk through the secret passages into the castle to decide, but when she did, the man would regret ever setting foot in Beerhaven. And Bernard? She wasn't entirely sure. She would have to wait and see. 43. What kind of army is that? Farm boys with pitchforks, just like I told you, with armor that doesn't fit, Goss scoffed as the men of Beerhaven marched into position. Bernard had to admit the man was right. Ursula's men moved slowly in armor far too big and heavy for them, carrying weapons they could barely lift. More axes than pitchforks, with a couple of swords. Even the troops lined up on the road below burst into loud laughter. It would be a slaughter. His only consolation was that Ursula was nowhere to be seen. She must be hiding somewhere. Good. Whatever happened today, she should have no part in it. She had seen enough blood and death in her life. Better that she didn't see the last of her people cut down. Father shouted an order and his archers sent a volley of arrows into flight. With near miraculous speed, the farm boys lifted their shields to block every one. But the shields kept rising and rising and as they brought them down, Bernard saw that Ursula's army had transformed. The giant-sized armor fitted the bears perfectly, their massive weapons seeming small in those enormous paws. Father ordered the archers to fire again, and they did, but the bears moved like men, taking the missiles on their shields. Incensed, he shouted for his infantry to charge, and they did. Bernard has seen battles and the aftermath, but he'd never seen anything like this. The biggest bear simply waded into Father's troops and swung his axe, taking out a swathe of them like a reaper did wheat. 3 times the size of a man? This bear was easily 5 times his size. Heads flew, blood spurted, and the bear bared his teeth in an unholy grin as he lifted his axe to collect another dozen heads. Bernard couldn't help it. He doubled up and vomited his breakfast on the flagstones at his feet. An armored hand dug into his hair and dragged him upright. "This is your fault, you puking ninny, and you will watch it. You should have just shut your mouth and been content with your life as the king's lover while I reaped the benefits, but you wanted to be a man. A man doesn't flinch at blood or battle. If you look away again, I'll send you down there to be slaughtered with them." Fury burned in Bernard's blood. He'd never liked his father, but now, knowing his father had deliberately sent him to be the king's bedwarmer when he was a child, he hated the man. He ripped his dagger out of its sheath and raised it, ready to stab his father in the heart he didn't have. Armored arms seized him, prying the dagger from his fingers as they held him. "None of that, boy," said one of the knights in his ear. Bernard turned his head. It had to be Sir Ivor, for Sir Shani's armor was enameled in red, while Ivor's gleamed silver. Father held Bernard's dagger to his son's throat. "I should just kill you now," he hissed. "I never should have let you live." "Harm him and you won't leave this valley alive," a female voice snarled. 44. Ursula made her way up the steps to the battlements. No one heard her over the sounds of battle below. 4 men and Bernard. She heard the words that could only have come from Lord Vauquelin, and her heart broke for Bernard. His own father had sold him to a cruel king, and now Bernard was old enough and man enough to object. The heartless lord intended to kill him. Whatever his faults, Bernard was hers now. Hers to defend or kill as the desire took her. "Harm him and you won't leave this valley alive," Ursula said, stepping forward. One of the knights laughed. "Oh look, it's the boy's whore. The kitchen maid who sucked his cock, hoping he might make her a lady for it. He lied to you, slut. The only inheritance his father will ever give him is a quick death. I told you you'd be better off with me. If you suck my cock right now, I might let you warm my bed for a while instead of killing you with your boyfriend here. His face might be hidden inside his helm, but Ursula recognized the voice of the Rat Knight. She held up her hand, blood still oozing from where she'd grazed it in the dark. A drop was all it took. This is for stealing my cheese. The knight's armor collapsed. Out of the mess crawled a red-eyed rat. The crazed beast charged at her, only to be caught by one of the castle cats, who'd been sunning himself on the steps. The other knights seemed to have been turned to stone, they stood so still. But Vauquelin recovered more quickly than his men. He released Bernard, then ripped his sword out of its sheath and advanced on Ursula. I don't know what sort of trick this is, but this ends now. This valley is mine, and I'm not about to let some slut stand in my way. He swung his sword back, ready to strike when he reached her, and Ursula knew she had only a moment to decide. Cockroach or rat? A cockroach would be easier to step on. Vauquelin gave a pained cry as he dropped his sword. No, he dropped his whole arm. How in heaven's name? Behind him loomed a bear that was easily twice the size of Pan. A monster as big as the ancient bears her grandfather had told tales about. His claws were tipped with blood. Vauquelin's blood, for he'd ripped the man's arm off. Vauquelin backed away, holding up his remaining hand in an effort to placate the beast, who only advanced on him as he retreated. What did that slut do to you? Vauquelin whispered weakly. The bear roared and swiped at Vauquelin again. Vauquelin threw himself back, but he'd reached the edge of the parapet, and the only thing behind him was the stairs to the courtyard below. He landed first on his severed shoulder, screaming like nothing Ursula had ever heard before. But he kept going, his legs flying up over his head as he rolled down the stairs to the flagstones. A sickening crunch silenced the screaming, followed by several more, but still the man tumbled until he landed in a crumpled heap in the yard. No man deserved his fate more, Bernard spat behind her. Ursula whirled. The giant bear was gone and Bernard stood in his place, his bloody hand shaking. How? She whispered, but even as the word left her lips, she had her answer. I cast a spell over all the men of the valley, that they might turn into bears to protect their home and family. But you... Bernard met her eyes. This is my home and you are my family. He turned to the two frozen knights. And anyone who thinks to claim Beerhaven had better think again. We are not defenseless and we will not be defeated. What is your choice, men? You served my father well, and someone must carry word of his death home to my brothers. If you leave our lands right now, I will be merciful and ask my wife not to turn you into rats like Goss over there. He jerked his head at the cat's leavings, little more than a scaly tail and some bloody intestines. The knights looked at each other, then turned and ran. Shouts came from below, and Ursula forced herself to walk to the battlements and peer at the battle's aftermath. So that's what a bloodbath looked like. She turned away, shuddering. Bernard's arm curled around her shoulder, pressing her face against his chest. Unhand the Baroness of Beerhaven, came a shout from the gates. On whose order? Bernard growled back. In a moment the wool against her cheek turned to thick fur, through which she felt the vibration of Bernard's roar, echoed down below by at least a score of her bear men, maybe more. His arm, or was it a paw? Whatever the appendage was, it curled around her as gently as before. A man in a bearskin, that's all, Ursula told herself, even as she covered her ears to shut out his bone-shaking roar. Then the roaring stopped, and Bernard was a man again, but a man with a rather silly grin on his face. What did they say? She asked. Hail the new Baron apparently, he said. As long as I meet with your approval, of course, because you can withdraw the gift. He stared at his hands for a moment, turning them over as though he'd never seen them before. They said you did this. Turned them into bears, and me too somehow. You're a witch. I don't know how I didn't see it, for you bewitched me from the moment we met. Ursula slumped. So you don't want to marry me anymore? What? No. Bernard cupped her cheeks, tilting her face up so he could gaze into her eyes. I love you, and the only thing keeping me from marrying you yesterday was my bastard of a father and his pet rat. If you can find your priest, I'll marry you now and any man who objects. He glanced down at the courtyard, where the two knights were carefully rolling his father's body into his cloak. Well, they can take their chances with my monster paws. 45. The only delay to their wedding was the townspeople's insistence on holding a wedding feast in their new Baron and Baroness's honor. They raided Vauquelin's camp, then took over the castle kitchens. Neither Bernard or Ursula uttered a protest. Finally, as the sun set, Father Jacques led them in their marriage vows, and Ursula got to kiss her husband for the first time. She suspected from the whistles and catcalls that she might have gotten a little carried away, but she didn't care. These were her people, as much a part of Beerhaven as she was. Or Bernard now, who found himself the center of attention at the feast. Everyone wanted to speak to the new Baron, and ask him how he'd managed to turn into a cave bear instead of the smaller brown bears the rest of them transformed into. Bernard didn't have an answer for them, and nor did Ursula. Finally, when they could not eat anymore, someone struck up a tune and the dancing began. Bernard's hand closed around Ursula's. I don't know about you, but I would like a private dance with you, for I'm sure you don't want to stand up with a cripple in front of all these people. A dance in your chamber, perhaps? She squeezed his fingers. I've been waiting for you to take me back to bed since yesterday morning. Let's go upstairs. The tower room smelled different. Someone had strewn the floor and the bed with sweet-smelling herbs, and a fire burned in the grate that neither of them had laid. A jug of mead sat on the table beside 2 cups, a loaf of bread and a pot of honey. It's the traditional wedding breakfast for the first morning of a honeymoon, Ursula breathed, unable to believe what she was seeing. Not until now had she ever thought she'd be allowed the Beerhaven bridal custom. Beerhaven would always be her home. She burst into tears. A lesser man might have hesitated, but Bernard knew her well, and only held her tight until the tears stopped flowing. What's wrong, Goldilocks? He asked. Nothing. Nothing. Everything's just right, she said, and smiled so brightly her cheeks ached. It was a good feeling. Now let's go to bed, for that feels just right too. 46. A week of wedded bliss flew by, each night as pleasurable as the last. Alika moved into the castle as the cook and housekeeper, ordering her new staff about and running the place with an efficiency that left Ursula breathless. Or perhaps that was Bernard, who always knew how to take her breath away. Ursula was in the kitchen, listening to Alika's report of what remained of their stocks in the cellar, when Berger, the boy who'd sounded the alert of Vauquelin's arrival, came running in. There's a riding party coming through the pass, he exclaimed breathlessly. How many? Bernard asked, looking up from shelling some nuts Ursula had never seen before. Something he'd brought from the Holy Land that he wanted to share with her, was all he'd said. As many as my fingers, the boy said, before running off. Ursula sighed. The stocktake will have to wait, Alika. We must greet our guests. She took Bernard's outstretched hand, and together they strolled out to the bridge. There was no sign of Berger's riding party, though. The road that had once been blocked by Vauquelin's camp was as clear as the spring sky above. Bernard tapped her shoulder. You are looking the wrong way. Ursula turned. Sure enough, he was right. 10 riders, walking 2 abreast, came down the overgrown King's Road that led from the other pass, the one to King Siward's kingdom. We're here to see the Baron, a lofty older gentleman announced. Bernard spread his arms wide. You see me? The gentleman coughed. Aren't you a bit young to be the Baron of Beerhaven? My father died on an assassin's blade before the start of winter. But he has been avenged, Ursula said. My husband Bernard is the Baron here now. The gentleman blinked. Finally he said, well then. I bring greetings from His Majesty King Siward and his deepest condolences on your father's death. His Majesty deeply regrets. A small cloaked figure rode forward, causing a stir among the other riders as they tried to surround the smallest of their number. Almost like guards, Ursula thought. Was this the Crown Prince? Oh, by all that's holy, shut up. Siward said to reforge the alliance and find out what they want from us to keep the valley on good terms to allow a free flow of trade. The girl ripped the hood from her head and stared avidly at Ursula and Bernard. Are the stories true? Do you have bears? The Crown Princess? Ursula wondered. She looked younger than Ursula herself. The miffed-looking gentleman bowed. Yes, Your Majesty. This girl wasn't old enough to be a queen, surely. She slid off her horse and bobbed a careless curtsy. I'm Rosamond. The queen from over the mountains. My father, King Almos, had trade agreements with Beerhaven. You protected the trade route with your bear army and held our goods and gold in trust when snow closed the passes. Before the war, while my mother lived, your valley was part of our kingdom and paid a tithe every year, I understand, until the year my mother died and all that ended. We're willing to declare you an independent ally if you have not pledged your loyalty to any neighboring king while we were closed to outsiders, as it were. She lifted her chin. So who is your king? King Siward, like King Almos was, Ursula said slowly. We kept your tithe for a while until it became clear that you were not coming to collect it, so we sold it. For 50 years we've done this, and kept the gold in trust for when your tithe collector came. There is berry wine too, which is not from here. Rosamond waved her hand as if 50 years' worth of food was nothing. Keep it. Consider it a gift, a reward for your loyalty. An ally has no need to pay us a tithe. Now, what percentage will you ask for trade passing through your valley? We have a lot of wine to export, 50 years' worth I believe, and we hope to move much of it over the mountains before the summer is over. Safety from bandits and thieves is something our northern neighbors cannot provide right now, but you. The Queen gave a little excited bounce. Please, can I see the bears? Even just one, I have heard so many stories. Bernard glanced at Ursula and she gave the tiniest nod. Stand back, Your Majesty. He concentrated, then swelled into an enormous monster, towering over the little queen. She clapped her hands. Oh, magnificent! You are more than even I imagined. Can you understand me? If you can, walk across the bridge and back. Bernard inclined his head and did as she asked. Even as a bear he limped, and Ursula winced in sympathy. Bernard might forgive her for it, but she would never forgive herself for the pain she'd caused him. Is it just me, or is he favoring that leg? Rosamond asked Ursula. It is an old wound that did not heal properly, Your Majesty, Ursula said. Oh, we can't have that. A spell for a spell is only fair, Baroness, don't you think? Rosamond dropped to her knees and Bernard had to pull up short to avoid stepping on her. The girl dug her fingers into a clump of grass and seized Bernard's injured leg in her other hand. Then she bit her lip and closed her eyes. Bernard shrank from bear to man in a moment, staring down at the crouching girl. What are you doing? Rosamond didn't answer. Finally she released Bernard in the grass, which was now knee-high, and said, There. That should do it. Try walking again, Baron. He took a tentative step, then another, and his eyes widened. What did you do? Rosamond rose and dusted off her knees. Heal you, of course. I don't do bears like your wife. I heal and play with plants. She smiled. No. What duty must our traders pay to pass through your valley? Bernard didn't seem to be capable of speech, so Ursula ventured, "Whatever you feel is fair, Your Majesty. I would pay every piece of gold in our treasury to anyone who would heal my husband, and you have done it. We are in your debt now." She dropped a deep curtsy. When she rose, she met Rosamond's eyes. For all her youth, her eyes told a different story. "Perhaps we should go inside and discuss things over some refreshments, Queen Rosamond." Rosamond's eyes lit up. "Tell me, do you still make Behaven cheese? It's been more than 50 years since I tasted it, but there was no finer stuff anywhere. It's the mountain milk, my mother told me." "We do, Your Majesty, and I would be honored to send some home with you," Ursula said. "Consider it a gift." Rosamond looked at her. "You know, you remind me a little of my mother. She would have been your great-great-aunt, I believe. Her sister was the one with the gift though, so mother left and she stayed. The bears have been here longer than our kingdom has existed," she said. "Women ruled then, queens in their own right, but the old ways fell away, and men gave this place a baron, a man to lead the bears. But there would be no bears, if not for the Lady of the Valley, for the gift is hers alone to give. Is it true what they say, that the lady cannot leave the valley?" "I've never tried," Ursula admitted. "But why would I want to?" She squeezed Bernard's hand. "Behaven is my home. Bears and all." This has been Raw. Goldilocks Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.